Hey everyone, I'm Taylor Jenkins, head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, and I want to welcome you and thank you all for joining us in today's conversation, an important conversation about education, engagement, and empowerment for all voters during the upcoming election season. Now, I'm new to the city of Memphis, and I've really tried to become vested in our state, our county, and our local governments, and really trying to understand how those governments can really make a difference in our everyday lives. There's obviously a lot of attention right now with the presidential race at the top of the ballot, but I want to highly encourage everyone to really take a long look up and down the entire ballot and really get a feel for what these potential elected officials can do to help our everyday lives and make change. You know, elected officials are the ones that can really help influence policies, create new policies, and hopefully create change. So it's great today to have this discussion to learn more and become more informed and educated about how these elected officials can really make change when they're in office. So I hope everyone today, including myself, will learn something. And hopefully if you do learn something, that I encourage you to go about informing others around you, the people closest to you, your family and your friends. Help them become more educated, help them become more informed and more empowered and invested in this upcoming voting process. So in today's discussion, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be talked about and we can learn from. You know, for example, the history of voting. What can a first-time voter expect during the process? What do they need to do? You know, why your vote counts. And also the process to vote during COVID-19 and how one can even do more than just vote. There are so many other ways to call to action to help make change. We'll learn all about that in today's great discussion. So again, I welcome you. And I thank you again for joining us in today's conversation. And lastly, I also want to remind you to please take the opportunity to participate in the important process of filling out the census questionnaire and being counted there as well. Thank you again and enjoy the conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking Coach Jenkins for those words and the Memphis Grizzlies for facilitating this conversation. My name is Faith Morris, and I'm the Chief Marketing and External Affairs Officer for the National Civil Rights Museum. Welcome to Grizzlies Community Conversation, beyond the court to the polls. Coach Jenkins was absolutely right. This is going to be an important conversation. It's good to hear that he has come to Memphis and wants to educate himself and engage in the process of voting. That was what we're going to do here today. By the end, we hope you will have learned something new and feel more empowered about the power you have with your vote. The work that I do at the National Civil Rights Museums helps me to position globally the institution chronicling the civil rights movement most comprehensively. This work interprets the history of voting. It includes that history. We currently have a campaign called Imagine an America that gives an in-depth and on-topic and more information and what to do about voting, how to get ready, and what is happening in your state. Visit civilrightsmuseum.org for more information about Imagine an America. Today, I'm going to highlight a little bit about voting, especially voting history of blacks. You know, here's an important question, and even more important, actually, the reality. When did blacks actually get the right to vote? And what happened after that? The 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote under the law, but exercising that right became another challenge. And black women? Well, for the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, that was a landmark for women's rights, but not so for black women. It took 50 more years for black women to actually exercise that right. But let's go back a little further, and very seldom do you do this, but you have to understand history, and it started after the Civil War. Right after the Civil War and the defeat of the Confederacy in 1865, 4 million enslaved black men, women, and children got their rights through the 13th Amendment, which gave blacks full citizenship, including the right to vote. But after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, all that changed. When Andrew Johnson became president, And he strongly believed in states' rights, which meant that states got to do what they wanted to do, and it changed from state to state. As a result, in 1865 through 1866, most southern states enacted restrictive laws known as black codes, which denied blacks many rights, including no voting. The black codes really reestablished slavery without calling it slavery. It was then in 1866 that Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill, developed to build on the 13th Amendment and to give black citizenship rights. But in 1867, a new Reconstruction Act was passed, and for over a decade, blacks voted in huge numbers across the South, electing 22 black men to serve in Congress, 2 in the Senate, and helped to elect Andrew Johnson's successor, Ulysses S. Grant. In 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which stated that voting rights could not be denied by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And for the first time during Reconstruction, there was a democracy for blacks in the South. Black voters and black officials were constantly intimidated, suffered acts of violence, even at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. So we go from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights era, and it was important to understand what happened before the 1950s and 60s. Although the 15th Amendment barred voting rights discrimination on the basis of race, it left the door open for states to determine their own specific qualifications for voting. And that's when the literacy test, the poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices came into play. Remember those black codes? Well, now they are Jim Crow laws. Same thing, but called something different. And that lasted for nearly a century, from 1877 to the mid-1960s. And I'm going to fast forward to what happened in the 1950s and 60s. Securing the voting rights for blacks in the South became a central focus of the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally banned segregation, but it did nothing for voting rights. So there is a pattern here. There were so many different versions of the vote. It included articles and acts and amendments, trying to strengthen them each time. The fight for voting rights for blacks was brutal. The struggle to eliminate race discrimination in voting involved the lives of many people. John Lewis, who we just recently lost, started very young. He helped and led the Freedom Summer efforts in 1964 to register black voters in the South. He joined Martin Luther King Jr. and thousands of others in that struggle, risking their lives and livelihood. But what we remember most was in 1965, the March in Selma, which drew unprecedented attention to the movement for voting rights. Also that year, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, which banned literacy tests and other methods that was used to disenfranchise black voters. So before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, an estimated 23% of eligible black voters were registered nationwide, and this talks about the power of the vote. By 1969, that number rose to 61%. By 1980, that percentage of black Southern voters surpassed that in the rest of the country. And by the mid-1980s, there were more black people voting in the South than there were blacks in the whole country. So that was significant. And then in 2012, turnout of black voters exceeded that of white voters for the first time. Black voters turned out at 66.6%, and that was to re-elect Barack Obama. In 2013, and this begins what we're dealing with now, the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, that it was unconstitutional to require states with a history of voting discrimination to seek federal approval before changing their election laws. So following that, a number of states passed new restrictions on voting, including limiting early voting and requiring voters to show photo ID, which is argued as a tactic to disproportionately affect poor, elderly, black, and Latino voters. And so here we are, 2020, and determining the best way forward to the November 3rd election. Please allow me to introduce my panel. You've been very patient, but we needed to set this tone for what we're going to talk about today. Commissioner Van Turner. Commissioner Turner is currently the president of the Memphis branch NAACP. He is a partner in the law firm of Bruce Turner, PLLC, and licensed to practice in Tennessee and Mississippi. He is an elected official, having served on the Shelby County Commission since 2014, representing District 12. He is also president of Memphis Green Space Incorporated, the nonprofit organization that facilitated the removal of the Confederate statues in Health Sciences Park and Memphis Park. He's a graduate of Morehouse College and the Tennessee State of Law. Welcome, Commissioner Van Turner.
Thank you.
Next, we have Sage Scott. Sage is a Memphis native and a sophomore at Clarence Day Scholar, a sophomore Clarence Day Scholar at Rose College. She is a Facing History and Ourselves alum and participated in the Engage Memphis voting campaign in 2018. She has interest in equitable education, social justice, human rights, and the arts. Sage is an award-winning recipient at the Memphis Youth Film Festival and represented Memphis at the Brave New Voices International Poetry Festival. Welcome, Sage Scott.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Senator Raumesh Akbari. Senator Akbari serves in the Tennessee State Senate representing District 29, which includes downtown Memphis, where the National Civil Rights Museum and Grizzlies are, and parts of Shelby County. She is a proud Memphian and passionate advocate for justice and equal opportunity. She serves as the second vice chairman of the Senate Education Committee and is a member of the Commerce and Labor Committee, the Energy, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Committee, and the Ethics Committee. Senator Akbari is a graduate of Washington University and the St. Louis University School of Law, and she, as we are proud, is a board member for the National Civil Rights Museum. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation. So glad to have you. You heard me briefly discuss some of the history of voting rights, and so seldom do we go past the 50s and the 60s, but there was a lot that laid the groundwork for what happened with the historic civil rights movement, right? Let's jump right in. So why is it important, and any one of you can answer this, why is it important to know this history?
Well, Faith, I could definitely jump in on that one. It's important to know the history so that you understand the pathway that was taken so that we could have the right to vote. It has not been easy. People have lost their lives, they lost their livelihoods, their lives were completely destroyed so that we could vote. And it's so simple, and it makes such a big difference. And I think also if we don't understand just how hard folks work to keep us from voting, it really it doesn't keep put into perspective why. Because there's so much that can happen with your vote. There's a reason why folks don't want us to do it.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I would agree. Just as you gave that history, I took some notes. So you first have the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, then you have the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and then I think the Voting Rights Act was at first renewed, I believe, in 1991 or in the 1990s. So in these three instances, you see that there's always a legislative push to facilitate the right to vote, and you have to do that because if you don't do it, we see what will happen and what's occurring now. We are facing a COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and this has also added a twist to how we're going to vote, and I'm sure we're going to discuss that later, but you have to understand the history so you won't repeat it. And so what we want to instill in our young people and those who are first-time voters is there's been a long history of efforts to make sure the ballot box is open to all. And you have to honor that struggle and honor those ancestors who really fought, bled, and died for the right to vote by casting your vote. If we don't do it, it's a slap in their face. And so we have to get to the polls whenever the polls are open, and we have to honor the rich legacy and struggle of all those who fought for the 15th Amendment, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and its renewal in Congress in the 1990s.
Sage, did you have anything on this one?
Absolutely. I think understanding the history is entirely essential to being involved in any democratic process. So if we're looking at this entire history of voting, so many people have been disenfranchised for so long. And in understanding the history, we'll better be able to grasp the perspective of the people that were trying to perpetrate voter disenfranchisement. And by understanding their perspectives, we'll understand what progress they were trying to halt in the past. And we can see how those progresses are still being halted and how that's reflecting in the modern issues that we're facing today. So understanding the history of voting helps you understand the gravitas and really what you're fighting for when you are going to the polls.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Turner, I'm going to come back to you. As the president of the NAACP Memphis Chapter, an organization that's been long active in issues, especially around voting rights, what challenges are you dealing with now?
Well, I think that we have to turn the protests into policy and eventually ensure that we protect that policy with our vote. And so the history of the NAACP is rich, it's storied. It began in 1909, and one of the key founders of the NAACP actually had a base or a home here in Memphis, Ida B. Wells Barnett. And so she wrote against lynchings, and in doing so, she had to leave town. And just having the rich legacy of Ida B. Wells to just show people that there's a history of courageous women and men who've been at the forefront of this struggle. And to know that she's a founder of this great organization really gives me inspiration to say that, sometimes it's not easy, but you have to keep fighting and you have to keep moving forward. The local branch was started in 1917. And the national spotlight on the NAACP was once again turned to Memphis when Benjamin Hooks, a famed judge and leader here in Memphis, became the president of the national organization for 15 years. And so Memphis, the Memphis chapter, has been at the forefront of the struggle with the NAACP. We now serve under President Derrick Johnson, a Mississippi native. And so understanding that history, understanding that the road to civil rights, the road to the right to vote, the road to the struggle that we hold so dear today runs right through Memphis. And so that again is inspirational. And we appreciate all the work that you've done with the Civil Rights Museum. And I think that's why it's important to really recognize the tie between Memphis and the NAACP, and why we have to, as the local branch, keep the struggle moving and keep doing what we're doing.
So Senator Akbari, as a member of the state Senate, you regularly deal with legislation that can directly affect voting rights. Tennessee was recently in the news for such legislation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sometimes it seems like every time we're in the news, it's not for a good thing.
Right.
It started, I think, the most recent situation. One, the last election in 2018, we saw a couple 100,000 black folks across the state register to vote. It was a big deal. It was a concerted effort to make sure folks weren't disenfranchised. Because of that, the Secretary of State came in and pushed legislation that was pretty restrictive around groups that were doing mass registrations. Fast forward to this year, we're facing the COVID-19 crisis. We really wanted to see the expansion of absentee ballots, those who have no pre-existing conditions or anything like that, a no excuse absentee ballot. The legislature blocked it. There was a lawsuit. They got it in place, but again, that was overturned. And then most recently, and this is probably the most devastating and frustrating, as you've seen the movement of really highlighting the racial injustice in this country kind of sweep across the nation, the legislature decided it was important to pass a bill that would, if you decided to camp out on state property, then you could be guilty of a felony, 1 to 6 years in prison, and lose your right to vote. So you see these different things that are happening that are disenfranchising folks, and it all, when you put it all together, it really is unfortunate, because what we'd like to see is a world where those who want to vote can, those who want to be a part of the process can, and that there won't be restrictive laws in place that makes it more difficult, because the vote is someone's voice. It's their power. It's their ability to have representation. It's so important, whether on a state, local, or federal level. So I'm fighting back against it. We'll see what we can do, but it gets to be pretty ridiculous when folks are trying to choose their voters as opposed to their voters being able to choose them.
So knowing all of what's going on in 2020, it's important for us to educate and register eligible voters and get them to the polls. So Sage, you worked on a voter education and registration campaign with Facing History in Ourselves. Tell us about that. Why did you get involved, and tell us about a little bit of the work that you did.
Well, I come from a family of people that have always considered voting to be very important. I got involved through my high school. I attended Memphis Central High School, and I graduated in 2019. So through what we were learning in class about the history of the civil rights movement, particularly surrounded by voting, I expressed a lot of interest, and I got involved with Facing History after school. So what we did with the program was look at our universe of obligation, look at the people that consider us important and the people that we consider important as well as our greater communities, and say, why are people in our community not voting? And we took different approaches in a very individual level of how to address why people in our community that perhaps may have never been registered or were registered at some point or haven't voted in many years, look at really why these individuals aren't voting and how this political apathy is taking place. And using our personal relationships with them, we made connections and came up with different ways to respond to people that might argue against the need to vote. So particularly, our group looked at encouraging adults in our lives, because we were too young to vote at the time, encouraging adults in our lives to vote as an active advocacy for the children in their lives who are not able to vote, or perhaps the undocumented individuals that are not able to vote, or people that have had problems with law enforcement in the past, and using your vote as a form of advocacy for underrepresented and unrepresented groups.
So all of you have seen the celebrities and the athletes that have gotten involved in this conversation. They're using their platforms. Let's talk about that for a few minutes. What do you think about it? Any one of you?
I love it. I mean, I think when one of the commentators told I think LeBron James to just shut up and dribble, I thought that was insane. I love that these folks, these athletes, these rappers, these folks that people look to as role models, especially young folks, are seeing them say, hey, vote. This is important. You need to take some time out. I say keep doing it. I love the Grizzlies for all that they're doing in Memphis to excite young people. And I think the sky is the limit, really. Every time I get on Instagram, I see Michelle Obama, I see LeBron James, I see John Legend. I mean, any celebrity you can think of, they're saying go vote. So more power, keep doing it. Let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, it follows a rich tradition. When you speak of Harry Belafonte, Sam Cooke, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I mean, they were fighting the fight in the 60s, and you see these young, dynamic athletes and entertainers doing the same thing in the present time. And so, as the senator has stated, it is inspiring. And, you know, I'm the father of 2 young men and a daughter. And so when my 15-year-old and my 13-year-old, when my sons see LeBron James or Ja Morant or any of these wonderful athletes who are out speaking for justice and speaking for equality and encouraging people to vote, you know, that does more than a father sometimes. You know, the father, you tell your children this is the right thing to do what daddy says, but, you know, they say, okay, dad, whatever. But when they hear Ja Morant or one of the players who they love to watch every day dribble the ball and do such great things on the court, when they say it, it strikes differently. So I think that's just important, more so for our young men and women to hear these athletes speak out.
I think it's incredible that so many celebrities and public figures and influencers are using their platforms to encourage people to have the right to vote, because despite what would happen in a perfect world. People that necessarily don't have political influence may not have influence over the predominant culture or youth. So people that do have that platform and people that are able to mobilize that platform to encourage particularly young people to vote, or anybody who has decided not to vote, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And it's really, I mean, the internet is the most democratic platform out there. And to see the internet be used in a way that can promote democracy is absolutely fantastic.
So I'm going to stay with you for a minute, Sage, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And we're also heading to a presidential election, but we have some first-time voters out there. So what do we need to do to engage our first-time voters?
To engage our first-time voters, empower them, help young people and first-time voters to understand that you have this immense political power. Like, when you elect someone, whether you particularly identify with a candidate or not, they work for you. Like, so you can email them, write them letters, understand that when you're going out to voting, you're essentially selecting somebody that has a say in your life. So you should be involved with that. And once they are elected, continue to have that rapport with them and communicate with them in order to live in the world that you want to live in, because the people that we elect now are going to affect the futures that we will eventually get married in, raise our children in, be born and die in. So it's incredibly significant. And do not let anybody have power over you that you did not select.
So now you're the only one on this panel that's not an elected official. That's why I let you go first. Because that perspective is really important. But as elected officials, you know, what is it that you do? I mean, that's part of what you have to do to get, stay in office, is to be able to contact and connect with first-time and apathetic voters. Especially, you have your platforms, you have those that are with you, but those that don't know what they want to do, what are you doing about that?
Well, like Sage said, I think it's about empowering folks. I tell folks when I go to speak, especially at high schools and in neighborhoods, I'm like, listen, why do you think elected officials, especially on a federal level, pay so much attention to senior citizens? It's because they vote. If you actually combine your powers and you, especially I think in the younger generation, they're acutely aware of climate change and really the dangers of not addressing it. Band together. One, you can select the candidate that you want and you can push forward. But two, vote. I mean, it's a big deal. For me, I think it's more about, for a certain generation, it's more about a one-on-one connection. So being accessible, making sure that you do pick up the phone, that you're on social media. I feel like I'm too old to get on TikTok, but maybe I will. But making sure
Never too old for TikTok.
right. Making sure I'm accessible on Twitter and Instagram. Apparently Facebook is for old people, I'm finding out. Gosh, y'all are killing me. Young people are killing me. But I think just making it something that they feel like they're a part of, and that their issues are on the table. Climate change, criminal justice reform, student loan reform, all types of things. And I think you can pull people in by saying, hey, this is your party too. Let's build from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Yep.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember the historic election of President Barack Obama in 2008, and he really revolutionized politics. He was the first, I think, modern candidate really at that level to really use social media. And if you recall, he raised a lot of money just by being online, and he wasn't necessarily relying on the big donations. Just everyday people were chipping in $5, $10, $15 to support the hope that he really espoused. And so, here's the issue. President Obama won't be on the ballot again running for president of the United States of America, but we still have to get out and vote. Every campaign is not going to be as sexy, it's not going to be as wonderful. The campaign we experienced with Barack Obama and seeing his wonderful First Lady Michelle Obama, but we still got to get to the polls and vote. And as Senator Akbari said, that's why older people really get so much of the attention, because they had to fight and struggle so much for their right to vote because they were denied it. So it's precious. So if it's the dog catcher on the ballot, they're going to vote for the dog catcher. If it's anything or anybody running for an election, they're there in present and counted for to vote. And we really have to pass that tradition on to the people behind us and behind our older generation, because they have to cherish their right, no matter who is on the ballot, who is running. You have to get out to the polls every election and vote.
So let's talk about the ballot. And we know that there's more to vote for than the president this time. There's always something on the ballot that folks have no idea about, are surprised about, have not gotten any information on. They are uninformed when they get to the polls. So what can we do about that, especially in Memphis and Shelby County? I mean, how can folks get the information that they need? What do you suggest that they do to be prepared voters, to plan to vote?
Well, I think you have to meet them where they are, first of all. And a lot of that, I think the same thing about voter registration and filling out the census. We can't, especially as elected officials, we can't complain and say, well, people aren't coming to our events, they're not doing X, Y, Z. Go where they are. Go to events that you see in the city. Make sure you're putting your information out online. What I would tell candidates to do is check with their election commission. Go to shelbyvote.com. You have a full list of all the candidates. You can look them up. Most of them have Facebook pages. They have Twitter. They have websites. And also go to their virtual events. Go by their campaign offices if they have them. It's kind of different because we're in 2020 as opposed to a regular campaign season. But engage with them because they want your vote. They need to work for it. As a candidate, I had to work for the votes that I wanted. I had to talk to folks. I had to explain what made me different from the people that I was running against. So I think it's all of that. But also as a voter, like, just do a little bit of homework, right? Like, I usually help my family. I give them a little guide, like this is who you should vote for. But it's not as big of a deal as you think. There's usually only a few candidates on the ballot. Make sure you're informed. The internet is a great place to get information.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, there's plenty of time to learn who's on the ballot and to really listen to what they're saying, their debates, their forums, their social media. And, you have time because here in Tennessee, we early vote. So it's not just a one-day vote. And if you don't have your mind made up right then and there, it's over with. You have 2 long weeks to vote here in Tennessee. So there's ample time to research what's going on and to get out and vote.
Absolutely. And the Memphis Public Library website is an excellent resource to learn about candidates and also just learn more about how the voting process works in general. And even feel free to reach out, as Senator Akbari said, through social media and following your potential elected officials on the internet is a really great way to learn more about them and see what they're doing for communities that you are in.
So what's your response when you run into folks, and I know you do because I run into them all the time, that say, it's just one vote. I mean, it doesn't count. My one vote doesn't count.
Well, look, my very first election in 2013, it was a district of over 70,000 people. Only 1,800 people voted. There were 7 candidates. I won by a balance of 100 votes. So it makes a difference. And we worked hard for those votes, let me tell you. On a state, on a local level, we control so much of your everyday lives, from the speed limit you drive on the streets to the textbooks your children read. It's really important to make sure you come out and vote, and it makes a difference. I have a friend in Georgia. She lost a Senate race by 11 votes. We have a guy in Knoxville right now who won a state house seat by 16 votes. So your vote does matter. It makes a tremendous difference. Don't let anybody tell you that or fool you. That they don't know what they're talking about. They're being apathetic, but they're telling you to give away your power. Your vote is a tremendous asset.
And for 8 hours of my life yesterday, from 2 to 10 o'clock, I was at a county commission meeting, and let me tell you, to drive this home, we were voting on whether or not tear gas could be used more or less against protesters. We were voting on whether or not the sheriff's office could receive military-grade equipment as part of the complement that would be given to officers in order to patrol our communities. So for all those BLM, Black Lives Matter protesters who are out fighting for justice, fighting for equity in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, this is why your elected officials make a difference. When it comes to who makes the decision on what can be used against protesters, who makes the decision if military-grade equipment can go to law enforcement officers, who makes the decisions on, the procedures for you to protest, if you can protest at all. Those are all laws that are decided upon by your legislators and your local elected officials. That's why it's important to not only protest and be vocal about when you see injustice, but also it's important to go vote for elected officials who have your same philosophy and who feel that you do, and who will put the protest into policy.
And as Senator Akbari said, these elections are won on such small margins, and something that young people in particular have that is extremely powerful is we know a lot of people. We're around a lot of people. I could guarantee you there's more than 16 people in any one of my college classes that would be more than willing to listen to me about my voting or who I would be encouraging to elect. So just the expanse of people that people of the internet generation have access to, and that we can encourage to vote in a way that would support us and support the communities that we care about, is immense, and it's such an untapped power.
So Sage, think about your earliest memory of voting. When was that? Who was running?
I would say my earliest memory of voting, because they didn't take me to the actual polls until I was much older, sorry. But one of my earliest and most impressive memories of voting is actually when my grandfather told me that he had to take a literacy test to vote in Mississippi in the 1960s. And he told us about how he had to read and interpret the U.S. Constitution. And while he was college educated, and he had the privilege of being college educated for one, and he was able to interpret the Constitution in a way that would allow him to be registered to vote, the white man who was also coming in to register to vote that day did not have to do the same thing. And that type of equity, that type of inequity has really always been a driving force, because people like my grandfather went out and voted, I do not have to go and sit a literacy test. So things like that are always what I remember when I think about voting and within my own life and experience.
Any voting memories for the two of you?
Look, okay, so I just keep this in mind. I've been a political nerd since I was a child. Mm-hmm. So I was in second grade this is when I learned I was a Democrat. Because I was talking to my parents and I'm like, I want George Bush to win. He's the current president. And my parents were like, no, we're going for Clinton. So that was my first memory, being in second grade, saying, okay, I'm going for Clinton. And I told all my friends I'm voting for Clinton. And I went to a predominantly white suburban school, so none of their parents were voting for Clintons. But I discovered that, yeah, I'm a little different, and that was it. I was bit from there, and I just got hooked on it.
Yeah, the first time I voted was for Bill Clinton in his first election, and I voted at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. I remember standing in line at the gym and making sure and wondering if I had transferred my voting credentials to Atlanta from Memphis. And it worked out, and I voted for Bill Clinton, who went on to become president. And so that was a great memory. And I've been back to the ballot each and every time they've opened it. I've voted since then, since turning 18.
Some of us grew up with voting as a pattern, a history. It had to happen. You had no choice. It was like going to college and voting. You had to do both of those. Senator Akbari, you were very young when you got into it. And in fact, you replaced someone who, she was an icon, Lois DeBerry. And when this young woman decided she was going to take her place, folks were trying to figure out what in the world is going on.
Yeah, it was definitely big shoes to fill. I actually said, look, I just hope I can just walk beside her footsteps. But I was 29 when I got elected. It was, and the Speaker Pro Tem DeBerry was 27. So there's been like a kind of a tradition of young women being involved. In the young lady, Representative London Lamar, who replaced me in that seat, she was 27 when she was elected. I mean, it was different. I was the youngest person in the room. One of my colleagues still calls me baby rep, even though I'm actually in the Senate. But I wanted to be able to make a change in my community. And I knew it's one thing to be out and to support community organizations, but it's another thing to actually be in the seat that gets to make the laws. I love it. I feel like it's just a great way to make a difference. And since then, we've been able to reduce the expungement fee for ex-offenders. We've been able to save local schools from state takeover. I mean, there's a guy in my district, and that's why it's so important that folks vote and get engaged. He moved from Georgia. He wanted to have a mobile barbershop. Well, that was illegal in Tennessee. So his grandmother emailed me and was like, hey, my grandson's here. He wants to have a mobile barbershop. We wrote the legislation, we worked the bill, and now he can do that. So there's real power in that elected office, and I really appreciate that I have the opportunity to serve my constituents and move things forward for them, no matter if I'm the youngest one in the room.
So what do you say when other young people want to become, an elected official, wants to get into the legislature? What do you say to them? So many of them are really worried about that big hill to climb, that it's a tough road to hoe.
I mean, it is. One, people are going to pick you apart. They're going to look at your background. They're going to look at what you have done and what you haven't done. But I say do it. Jump in with both feet. If you're passionate about it, if it's something you want to do, and you're willing to work hard, it will work out. And I'll give you an example. Sometimes you might lose that seat. I have a friend, his name is Mandela Barnes. He's in Wisconsin. He ran for the state house. He won. He was young, cool, right? Ran for the Senate, lost. He didn't give up. He stayed involved in politics. Now he's one of the youngest lieutenant governors in the entire country, 33 years old. So you can do it. Just stay motivated. Don't let anybody detract you. The sky really is the limit if you're in it for the right reasons. And just also know, you see a lot of the glamour, you see the honorable and all these other titles that you hold, but it's hard work. You're not making money from it, because if you are, you're probably going to jail, like real talk. So just make sure you're committed and you're in it for the right reasons, but jump in with both feet.
Commissioner, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. I actually got involved in politics when, again, President Obama was elected. I won Democratic chair for the Democratic Party here locally, and then from there I was elected to the county commission. You always really got to, one, treat this as public service. We are term limited, so at least in my seat, we're term limited, so I can't be on the commission forever. And so, what are you going to do with the 8 years that you have to make a difference? And that's how you have to view it. And when you go into the office every day, you got to ask yourself, what are you going to do to make a difference? What are you going to do to make sure that people who need assistance and need help get it? And, and make sure that, when you do that and you do it correctly, you can sleep good at night. And when you leave office, you know that you've done a good job and you've rendered public service, great public service.
The three of you are so impressive in all the ways that you do what you do. Leave us with some parting words. Leave us with some advice. Leave us with what you want us to remember as we go into this voting season, not just for this general election that's coming up in November, but in those elections that after that aren't as sexy, they don't have as much going on, but are even more critical because it's determining local policy.
All right, well, I'll start. I'll just say this, make sure that you get involved. It's whether you're volunteering on a campaign, whether you're registering folks to vote, whether you are yourself running as a candidate. There are so many different ways to participate in the political process, and it's important. If it wasn't important, folks would not be trying to compromise and take away your right to vote every day. There would not be concerted efforts, well-funded efforts to make it more difficult for you to vote. So jump in, recognize that is your power. It truly is your power. Register to vote, register your friends, register your family, and also make sure you fill out your census application. That makes a big difference as well. So just be aware, be involved, and even beyond November the 3rd, we have elections every year, so make sure that your voice is being heard.
Yeah, and voters are smart. I mean, you just can't pop up and say, hey, I want to be this, and they just put you in. They have to see the body of service and the body of work. What were you doing when you didn't have the honorable in front of your name? What were you doing when the spotlights were not on and the cameras were not on? If you put in the work, the community would acknowledge that, and the voters would put you in the proper place. But you just can't wake up one day and say, I want to be emperor and be appointed to that. And so to all those young people who are interested in running for office, get out and help other candidates run. and get out. And I'll say that the first campaign that I was involved in, I was putting signs in yards in the hot sun in the Memphis summertime. That was back in the 90s when Congressman Ford was here. And those were my first campaigns. And it was not sexy, it was not glamorous, but it really taught that you have to have a commitment and you have to work hard in order to get to where you want to be.
And so, Sage, I saved you for last because you represent one of the biggest voting blocks there is, right? And needing to be motivated and to understand what this process is. So outspoken on what the vote is. So tell us, what's your advice as we go?
My advice, as somebody that's a part of Generation Z and is now eligible to vote, as a generation, we grew up with so much information available to us, and therefore we learned so much about the inequity of the world from a very young age. And before we were even able to have the right to vote, so many of people in our generation were out protesting, signing petitions, and doing everything that we could to be involved. Now a lot of us are old enough to vote, and we should not eschew that right and push it to the side as something that is not important. We are able to participate in the democratic process in a way that could potentially lead to unprecedented change in America. And we are going to be here in this country together for a while. And every incremental step, every vote, local, national, matters. And we need to vote for a world that we want to live in. And while social media activism is incredibly important and has its place, there are these systems in place, like voting and elections, that truly have the lion's share of control, of power. And we in America are able to participate in these very powerful institutions such as voting. And it would be a shame if, as a generation that is so large and so powerful and has such incredible values, it would be a shame if we were to forget that we do have that power, and it would be a shame not to act on that power.
So on behalf of the Memphis Grizzlies, I want to thank our panel. You all have been amazing, and hopefully you have motivated us to get out to the polls, but also motivated us to know what we're voting for, to be planning to vote so that we are informed as voters and then get out there. So thank you to Commissioner Van Turner and Sage Scott and Senator Raumesh Akbari. We thank you very much. Elected officials determine policy that affects our everyday lives. That's on the state level, that's on the local level, that's on the federal level. Your vote counts. Your vote is extremely needed. Your vote, your voice. You've heard everyone else's call to action. I also would challenge you all, if you are 17 or older, please register to become a poll official. You know, I'm thinking about being a poll watcher this year. My daddy did it forever, and I really respected him for that. Also, please be sure everyone in your network is registered to vote. The last day to register to vote in Tennessee is October 5th. Really, really important date. For more information about voter registration deadlines and becoming a poll worker, please visit grizzlies.com/vote. Grizzlies.com/vote. The Memphis Grizzlies organization is challenging us to go beyond the court to the polls, and we're going to do it. Please stay tuned for a special message from Jaren Jackson Jr.
This is Jaren Jackson Jr. with your Memphis Grizzlies, and I want you to join me at the polls on November 3rd. Every election matters, every vote matters, every voter matters, and that means you. So remember these 3 things. Be sure you're registered, know your candidates, vote on election day, or cast an absentee ballot in advance. Real change starts at the polls, so real change starts with us.